Hello. I'm sorry I can't be here to speak to you in person today, but I've recorded this lecture in advance, and I'm sure Josh will let me know if there are any questions you'd like me to answer at a later date. Josh has invited me to talk about the ways in which Scottish traditional music was being transformed for new audiences in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I believe it's really important for today's traditional musicians to understand what earlier generations perceived Scottish music to be. After all, we don't expect our physical landscape to remain the same for centuries. Buildings are knocked down, replaced, or the ground might be left empty. Motorways and roundabouts appear where once there used to be farms or tenements. So if our physical landscape can change so much, it's not surprising that our cultural landscape, the Scottish music repertoire, and the way it was collected, performed, and published has changed just as much. It's important to know something about the Scottish song collections of earlier times and their collectors to understand what was motivating them and what really mattered to them. It's also important to remember that what seems old-fashioned today was once seen as contemporary. After all, accompaniment styles and chord progressions have changed even between the 1960s and today, and that's only half a century away. People's expectations of what they'll find in a traditional songbook today will in some ways be different to what was expected in the middle of the 20th century or the beginning of the century. Could you tell which is earlier of these two? PowerPoint 2 shows two settings of the same tune, and I'm going to play two different versions of that tune. Looking at the books themselves, it's easy to tell. The Faber book, called The Language of Folk, was only published in 2013. It has a CD in the back. Actually, that's already a bit old-fashioned. And the settings use extended chords, 9, 11, 13, and so on, or added tones. And there is also a written-out piano accompaniment, not to mention historical and performance notes. The early McCall book from the mid-20th century folk revival era just has a tune and simply chords above the melody. But both books are modern compared to the collections in which I've had a close interest. You can imagine there will be considerable differences over the space of a couple of centuries. Since you're only seeing my virtual self, I can't ask how many of you regularly use historical collections of songs, tunes, or pipe repertoire, say from the Victorian era or even earlier. People's motivations for producing a song collection aren't always the same. For example, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, some collections were deliberately put together with no accompaniment at all, just tunes and words, or even just the tunes. The compilers of these collections were anxious that their Scottish heritage might disappear altogether with the passage of time. They collected songs almost like a stamp collector collects stamps. They just wanted the raw tunes because there was a perception that this was how native peasant tunes originated. And they also liked to think that the tunes were stripped back to their original simplicity, without any ornamentation or decoration, for the same reason. There are a few problems with this approach, of course. To start with, it wasn't until the late 18th century that much effort was made to collect Scottish tunes from working class people in the first place. Up till then, songs would often be included in collections, having been collected from earlier books, rather than the more romantic idea that they had been taken down from farm workers of humble origins. An Englishman called Joseph Ritson paid lip service to the idea that tunes should be collected from the people, but his Scottish music collections don't show much evidence that he did so. So although it's nice to imagine that a traditional song has humble, lowly, anonymous beginnings, the reality is that somebody did originally compose it, and we can't always know who they were or their social background. A further problem is that orally transmitted tunes aren't always written down the same way. Sometimes ornamentation is indicated just by the wee hieroglyphics showing where to play a trill, but at other times, extra passing notes can be written out until they're essentially part of the tune. So much for unaccompanied collections. Other collections were intended to be sung with an accompaniment of some kind. In some cases, the compilers started out thinking they would compile a book of unaccompanied tunes, but their friends persuaded them that accompaniments would be useful. That's what happened with Patrick and Joseph MacDonald's Highland vocal airs, which actually have no words, but they do have sketchy accompaniments. I'll play the unaccompanied tune, and then I'll play it again with the accompaniment. Obviously, song collections reflect the times in which they were written. PowerPoint 3 shows a modern collection of songs with guitar chords and the CD at the back, showing it wasn't published recently. So in the same way, 19th and early 20th century collections have their own distinctive flavours. PowerPoint 4 reminds us that music intended for use in the domestic setting would therefore have a keyboard accompaniment of some sort. Some books, like Patrick and Joseph MacDonald's instrumental collection, or James Johnson's Scottish Music Museum, I have a book copy of it here. These books have just a bass line with or without figured bass symbols, the 18th century equivalent to guitar chords, and the pianist would expand the accompaniment from that. PowerPoint 5 shows you an example of figured bass. Other books had a proper piano accompaniment, albeit with varying levels of proficiency. For example, Alexander Campbell's Albyn's Anthology was published in 1816 and 1818. We have a reproduction here in the library. This one's fascinating because he genuinely did travel widely to collect his repertoire. That's what makes the collection interesting. But at the end of the day, his accompaniments weren't all that good. A few compilers also included a violin line as well as the vocal line, and quite often you would find the words had been written or improved upon by famous poets of the day, such as Robert Burns. One compiler, George Thomson, used Robert Burns as lyricist and commissioned the best European composers of the day to do his arrangements, people like Haydn and Beethoven. But most people didn't go to quite those lengths. The trouble with Thomson's arrangements was that the accompaniments were sometimes totally out of their original Scottish folk idiom. What's more, Thomson regularly complained to Beethoven that the Edinburgh young ladies couldn't play his arrangements, and that tells us precisely who was buying them. I'll play you an example of one of Beethoven's settings, Hey Johnny Cope. Beethoven was just sent the tune, no words, and had to devise a musical setting. By the middle of the 19th century, no one was publishing song collections with the bare bass-line kind of accompaniment. That had long gone out of fashion. Most Scottish song collections had a proper piano accompaniment of some kind. Moving with the times, compilers had realised that art song settings would sell better than the bare antiquarian settings of earlier years. However, one particular book was a bestseller despite not having any accompaniments. That was a book called The Songs of Scotland Prior to Burns, with the tunes. We have a modern reproduction of that one here in the library. It was edited and published by Robert Chambers in 1862. It had the words, their melodies, and historical notes, and Chambers evidently expected a wide usage. Listen to how his introduction ends. It is meant as historical in its general scope and arrangement, and may satisfy all ordinary inquirers into the subject as a department of the national literature. And he goes on, it is also hoped that the collection may be serviceable amongst those who have not consented to the entire banishment of our national airs from the drawing room. PowerPoint 6 shows you a song from Chambers' collection. PowerPoint 7 shows you two particular song collections that were hot favourites in the second part of the 19th century. One, Vocal Melodies of Scotland, was first compiled by Finlay Dunn and John Thomson in 1836 for an Edinburgh firm called Paterson's, and the other, The Songs of Scotland, was edited by George Farquhar Graham for an Edinburgh and Glasgow publisher called John Muir Wood. This one was first published in 1848. Again, we have it here. Both went on being published for 60 years, give or take a few revisions. In fact, Finlay Dunn and George Farquhar Graham weren't rivals, but good friends, and they worked together on some collections. Their approach to the repertoire did have minor differences. Graham was more interested in the history of the songs, and Dunn was perhaps a little more interested in the performance and interpretation. If anything, Dunn and Thomson's books were slightly more aimed at performance, as you'd see if you looked in the prefaces of either the Vocal Melodies of Scotland or Dunn's Gaelic collection, Oireann na Albain. So here's an example of Dunn and Thomson's concern for the performer. The introduction declares that, and I quote, some of the finest Scottish songs have been published hitherto in keys quite unsingable by the generality of voices. The editors boast that they've provided accompaniments showing, and I quote again, an appropriateness of style and facility of execution. And they say that the editors have also supplied marks of expression to guide those either unacquainted with the Scottish style or had no teacher to guide them. And in Dunn's Gaelic collection, he says that the accompaniment is simple and appropriate and gives a few suggestions as to the manner of singing the songs. Donne says that the performance should be simple and natural. Due expression of the words will occasionally require the time to be retarded or accelerated. Rhythm is irregular. But the only observation that really made me widen my eyes was his comment, you'll be surprised by this one, that long drawn-out sounds seem to be a characteristic feature in the style of the music of many mountainous countries, originating from the physical conditions being favourable to the production of echoes. I should explain the Victorians loved echoes. By contrast, George Farquhar Graham's collection had lots of notes about the backgrounds of the songs. These were good middle-of-the-road collections suitable for average performers to use at home. The piano parts weren't too difficult, but supported the singer. And there were little introductions and link passages between verses to give the singers a chance to breathe. PowerPoint 8 shows that every care was taken to make sure the words were clean and wholesome. They didn't want their womenfolk offended by anything vulgar. These middle to late 19th century compilers, Graham, Donne and Thomson, were all educated professional musicians. They were generally more proficient at musical arrangements than the likes of Alexander Campbell before them. The best compilers knew about manuscripts and other early sources. In fact, John Thomson was a music professor at Edinburgh University. Their collections show less interest in going out into the field to gather songs and airs, but there were by now plenty of earlier publications of lowland Scottish songs for them to plunder. Certainly, they drew upon early sources, but they didn't so much see the need to go out transcribing tunes from live performances. When I'm looking at old collections of tunes, whether vocal or instrumental, I always look at the prefaces and the notes supplied by the compiler. There is so much you can find out about their preferences and general approach before you start looking at the notes themselves. For example, subscribers lists are always interesting. You don't always find them, but some books have lists of the people who paid up front and basically funded the publication. A roughly contemporary history of English popular song, Popular Music of the Olden Time by William Chappell, has a big subscribers list where we can see that his book was aimed not just at the gentry and the nobility, but also at music scholars, academics, church organists, and music teachers. An advertisement promoted it as a book that, and I quote, "ladies will delight in it for its music and graver readers for its curious learning." Graham's Songs of Scotland must have been aimed at a similar audience, and Donne and Thomson's focusing a little less on learning and more on performance, aimed more at amateur musicians. PowerPoint 9 brings us to a song that everyone will know, Afton Water. First in Donne and Thomson's Vocal Melodies of Scotland from 1836, then in George Farquhar Graham's slightly later Songs of Scotland from 1848. I'll play brief excerpts, and you'll see the Donne accompaniment is simple but effective. Later, he hints at modulation from F major to C major by introducing B naturals, and that is something that the earlier arrangers probably wouldn't have done. Graham's setting, by contrast, has an Alberti bass kind of accompaniment, broken chords that could almost be a guitar accompaniment. Note the tune in the left hand at the very start of Graham's arrangement, something else that comes straight from the art music tradition. So here we have them, samples of the two different settings, and then I'll play you a couple of excerpts from Schubert's songs so that you can see the similarities in accompaniment style. You can tell that although the melodies have a different flavour, the accompaniment styles in the Scottish songs and the Schubert art songs aren't actually that different. Finlay Dunn had connections with important people. He did the musical arrangements for Lady Carolina Nairn's Lays of Strathern. Although he was brought up in Edinburgh, he also had Highland connections, and one of his Gaelic collections consisted of arrangements of songs collected by an anonymous collector who was possibly an Edinburgh lady. He had a hand in another collection of pipe tunes and other tunes set for the piano, dedicated to Lady Eleanor Campbell of Islay. Now, it's quite significant that these Gaelic Highland collections were being assembled at this time. After all, there were plenty of published music collections of Lowland Scottish songs, but not as many Gaelic music collections. Highland collectors still felt there was a rich seam of Gaelic songs which might otherwise fade away out of use and become forgotten. A similar thing was happening in Wales at the same time. I think this explains why the urge to preserve the repertoire was probably stronger for longer in the Gaelic collections. What's more, if you consider the history of Gaeldom in the 19th century, with the clearances, the arguments about croft and land ownership, and massive emigration, Gaelic speakers in the Highlands and Islands had good reason to feel resentful. You will probably know that the Education Act Scotland effectively banished Gaelic from Scottish schools in 1872. Not only was there to be no Gaelic spoken in class, but children could even be punished for speaking it in the playground. The Highlands were effectively depressed both economically and socially, and the culture was being squeezed out of existence by the political authorities. The efforts to preserve Highland songs and tunes were certainly motivated by all these factors. PowerPoint 10 brings us to further political considerations. A combination of resentment at the smothering of their language and the political nationalism arising from all the upheaval caused by the clearances and land arguments led to various attempts to improve the situation. So in 1872, the Lorne Ossianic Society was founded with the aim of promoting the Gaelic language, literature and traditions. There were annual Highland Games and singing competitions. Although it foundered after a decade or so, some of the surviving members got together and helped bring about the foundation of An Common Gaelach, the Gaelic Speakers Association, in 1891. The continued fight for the Gaelic language did gradually begin to get results. By the end of the 19th century, Gaelic was gradually beginning to be taught in universities and teacher training colleges. And the 1918 Education Act at least gave the opportunity for getting Gaelic back into the curriculum, even if not very much happened at first. One of the founders of the Gaelic Speakers Association was a Professor J.S. Blackie. He was the Emeritus Professor of Greek at the University of Edinburgh. But Scottish culture mattered just as much to him. As well as encouraging Gaelic culture and encouraging non-Gaelic speakers to learn the language, he also studied Scottish song. And he published a book in 1889 called Scottish Song, Its Wealth, Wisdom and Social Significance. He saw Scottish song, or at least the best of Scottish song, as morally, intellectually and aesthetically improving, and his selection of songs was based on a combination of their popularity amongst the great mass of the people, as he said, and others, which embodied, and I quote, what is best in Scottish life. It's interesting to read his book with a view to discerning what he thought was important about Scottish song and what its place was in Scottish society at the time. He thought music should be an educational force and not just for, I quote, exhibition and accomplishment in polite society. He was adamant that Scottish music was the music of the people, and he complained that music's importance wasn't properly recognised in the Scottish educational system of his day, whether we're talking about Scottish songs or other kinds of music. I liked his comment that, I quote, "a Scottish young lady in a Scottish West End drawing room probably wouldn't think of singing a Scottish song because she would say they were too difficult or too wide-ranging." But Blackie said this was untrue, apart from the songs which had originated as fiddle tunes. Blackie thought that West End residents were too genteel to sing Scottish songs, and he commented that other excuses offered was that there was too much range of expression, that the songs were too dramatic, or that the fair performer couldn't sing in dialect. Comments like these are quite significant because Anne Comyn Galach revived Gaelic culture across quite a wide range of people, involving schools, choirs, and indeed whole communities, in something you'll already know about, the annual celebration of Gaeldom, known simply as the Mod. PowerPoint 11 reminds us that, following on from the earlier Lorne Ossianic Society, Anne Comyn set up the first Mod competitions within a year of its foundation, and 1892 saw 3 hours' worth of competitions taking place in Oban, 10 competitions and 50 entrants, to be precise. From those early beginnings, the Mod has grown to occupy a week. PowerPoint 12 illustrates the National Bard, an appointment that was made every year from 1923 to 1979. Other kinds of competitions came and went over the years, including craftwork competitions, but the main focus is still on literary and musical competitions, both for solo singing and for Gaelic choirs. Interestingly, the choral Gaelic song settings were in a distinctive but completely unidiomatic style, almost like hymn singing. PowerPoint 13 shows a publication called the St. Columba Collection of Gaelic Songs, which originated in the late 19th century. These have been described as the prototype for all future choral arrangements in the Mod. And it's not surprising they sound like hymn singing because they originate from songs sung by the Gaelic St. Columba Church Gaelic Choir. However, although they use Gaelic folk song melodies, they lose much of their Celtic flavour by the time they have been straitjacketed into 4-part choral harmony. You could call it Highland Laddie meets Presbyterian Psalms. Let me play you one of these choral settings, Hennig and Gilly-Doo, and PowerPoint 14 shows you the whole setting. I'll just play the melody over and then I'll play the whole setting. Such a tune was surely never meant to end up in a setting like this. Perhaps the Fèis movement in recent years has gained momentum in recognition of the fact that the Mod has such an old-fashioned feel about it. Nevertheless, as a social, communal expression of Gaelic culture, we can't ignore the Mod's influence over the past century. To be a winner in the Mod still counts for a lot, and the leading choirs and schools still battle fiercely for their titles. Now, PowerPoint 15 shows you a very controversial lady. By contrast with the kind of music sung at the Mod, the early 20th century also saw a totally different flourishing of Gaelic song in middle-class drawing rooms at the hands of Marjorie Kennedy Fraser. Hers was a well-meaning middle-class attempt influenced by Irish and European writers, song collectors, and classical musicians. Her song settings have been loved and loathed in equal measure, but for a long time they actually represented Gaelic culture to very many people in Britain and abroad. So it's important to understand just what her contribution actually was. Marjorie Kennedy Fraser did have Highland origins because her grandparents came from Perth. Grandfather Kennedy was a church precentor who led the singing in church and gave singing lessons. Her father, David Kennedy, was a Perth businessman. Marjorie was born in 1857, the second child of his second marriage. In the late 1850s, David Kennedy moved the whole family to Edinburgh and became a professional singer and singing teacher. Between 1862 and 1866, they lived in London. Then he and his wife, and Marjorie's older sister, set off to tour America, leaving the younger children with Elizabeth's mother in Perthshire. His mission in life was to take Scottish song to Scottish people who had emigrated abroad. By 1871, David and Elizabeth had 11 children, and his singing ambitions had also increased. They toured worldwide to Africa, Australia, New Zealand, America, and Canada. From when she was a young teenager, Marjorie not only sang in vocal ensembles with her father and whichever brothers and sisters were currently on tour, she also became his accompanist. Several of the brothers and sisters went to Italy for classical singing training, attending operas and, in the case of two of her brothers, even singing in them. Marjorie's autobiography, again, we've got it in the library, is an interesting read. It doesn't take very long either. She names some of the books that her father used as source material for his recitals, so that we know he owned key collections such as Johnson's Scots Musical Museum, first published in 1787 to 93, but reissued in 1839 and 1853, and a book of Scottish song texts known as Hurd's Collection. He also had a late Georgian collection, the Scottish Minstrel, dating from 1821 to 4, by Lady Nairn and Robert Archibald Smith, and Chambers' tunes-only book, Scots Songs Prior to Burns, which I mentioned to you earlier. In adult life, Marjorie settled in Edinburgh and began giving lecture recitals on Scottish songs in her own right. She started to wonder how she could incorporate Gaelic songs into her repertoire. Her interest was encouraged by Professor Blackie, the man who was around this time compiling materials for his Scottish songbook that I mentioned earlier. Marjorie took lessons in Gaelic and Gaelic songs from a poetess called Mary McKellar who lived in Edinburgh. Marjorie married a cousin of her mother's in 1887. Soon after they were married, he was appointed head teacher at Allen Glen's Technical School in Glasgow. But he died in 1890, leaving her with two young children, David and Patuffa. She supported them by working as a music teacher and critic, and evidently a very determined lady. This didn't stop her going to hear Wagner in Bayreuth in 1899, or founding the Edinburgh Musical Education Society in 1900. Around this time, she also got to hear about a French song collector called Louis-Albert Bourgault du Coudray, who lived from 1840 to 1910 and compiled a book of Breton songs at the request of the French government. You can find his book on archive.org. This gave her the idea of going to the Hebrides to collect Gaelic songs herself, and she first went to Eriskay in 1905. PowerPoint 16 shows you an influential man that she met in Eriskay, a Catholic priest called Father Alan MacDonald, who was a collector of Gaelic poems and folklore himself. He was very knowledgeable and helpful to her. 2 years later, in 1907, she went back to Eriskay, performing a recital of the songs that she had collected, and taking with her an early recording machine called a graphophone to record more songs. PowerPoint 17 illustrates what the graphophone was like. This trip was the first of her Hebridean collecting trips, and she later went to Barra, taking her daughter Patuffa with her to help with the recording machine. Margaret Bennett's great-grandfather was one of the singers she recorded. The School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh has these original recordings. Her trips went on over the next 20 years. Patuffa played the clarsach and assisted in subsequent recitals, and Marjorie's sister also took part in the concerts. PowerPoint 18 shows you the collections that Marjorie was most famous for. The 3 volumes entitled Songs of the Hebrides. Here's one of them. They were dating from 1909, 1917 and 1921. Between that, she wrote Sea Tangle and then From the Hebrides in 1925, and More Songs from the Hebrides in 1929. For all but the last one, she had a collaborator who worked on the Gaelic texts and translations for her. His name was Kenneth McLeod, and he was a theological student from the island of Eigg when they first met. He later became a minister. Between them, they created something exceptionally marketable, which, as I've mentioned, became almost synonymous with Gaelic song to very many people in the first decades of the 20th century. There was more than one problem, though. In the first place, Marjorie and her accomplice were hardly faithful to their sources. Sometimes the Gaelic words did belong with the tunes. Sometimes words from more than one song were put together, either to the correct tune or to a different one. Sometimes the words weren't accurate transcriptions, but were worked up to create a suitably Celtic, folksy feel. Sometimes bits of tunes were drawn together to make a suitable vehicle for a particular text. The permutations were endless, but it means they cannot be taken seriously as a collection of original Gaelic folk songs, beautiful and atmospheric though they may be. Lovers of folk music do tend to look down on the songs for this reason. The second problem is the musical settings themselves. Marjorie was a highly competent arranger and songwriter, and her piano accompaniments are beautiful in a classical art song sense. They're romantic, impressionistic, full of small details like a spinning wheel effect or any number of harp-like accompaniments, which is hardly surprising considering they could be played not only on the piano but also by her daughter Patufa on the glasach. And I'll play you a couple of brief examples of these effects. I'm pretty sure you'll have heard some of her most famous settings. Perhaps the most famous one is the Eriskay Love Lilt, which is readily found on YouTube. The library has a CD of Kennedy Fraser's songs recorded by Lisa Milne, who is one of our alumni. Now, you may have heard people use the expression Celtic twilight to describe the period at the turn of the 19th century. There was a collective impulse to celebrate what they perceived as the last years of the old Celtic traditions, with Oceanic-themed songs, poems, literature and art, and an obsession with fairy tales, folklore, supernatural beings, and eerie Celtic landscapes full of haunted castles, mountains and lakes, and a profound sense of loss for something that was disappearing, perhaps never to be quite the same again. Indeed, Kenneth MacLeod wrote a coda to the first volume of Marjorie Kennedy Fraser's Songs from the Hebrides, entitled Celtic Gloom, about the mournful nature about much Celtic lore and poetry. PowerPoint 19 reminds us not to assume that the Celtic twilight hovered only over the Highlands and the Hebrides. The phrase comes from a book of essays and folk tales compiled by the Irish writer William Butler Yeats, who was very much part of the Irish nationalist movement and did much to popularise the native mythology of Sligo. Marjorie knew of his writings and even met him. And of course, as I've already mentioned, another of her inspirations was the collection of Breton folk songs assembled by Bourgault du Coudray. PowerPoint 20 shows you one of the songs, and this is what Bourgault du Coudray's settings sounded like. Now, as I mentioned before, Marjorie was musically quite sophisticated. She was a classically trained singer and enjoyed singing Schubert and Schumann songs, though neither was modern by the time she was old enough to learn them. As I mentioned, she'd been to Bayreuth in Germany to hear Wagner operas, and she liked the music of the French composer Claude Debussy, who lived from 1862 to 1918. There's an anecdote about when she went to a particularly atmospheric, disused harbour on Barra. And what did she immediately think of? Debussy's opera, Pelléas and Mélisande, written in 1902, a work which was, incidentally, very different in style to Wagner's work. Claude Debussy was what's called one of the French Impressionist composers, and his chord palette couldn't have been more different from the comparatively straightforward harmonies of Schubert and Schumann, with lots of added sevenths, ninths, 13ths, and unusual chord progressions. Debussy's 2 books of piano preludes appeared between 1909 and 1913. There's every chance Marjorie might have heard of these too. PowerPoint 21 shows a bit of Kennedy Fraser's Sleeps the Moon in the Deep Blue Sky, alongside a bit of Debussy's piano piece, La Cathédrale Engloutie. I can't help thinking there are certain stylistic similarities between the chording in his piano piece and Kennedy Fraser's setting. Not a copy, just similarities. You can hear Sleeps the Moon again on Lisa Milne's CD in the library. As I've already said, Marjorie Kennedy Fraser and Kenneth MacLeod took so many liberties with their materials that it can be hard to identify genuine Gallic airs with their words. I tried to cross-reference between her major collections and the St Columba Gallic Choir Book, and I found very few songs where both the tune and the words matched. However, there were a few. Part of the charm of Kennedy Fraser's collections are also the little personal anecdotes about how she obtained her tunes. For example, she says the melody for the Sky Fishers song was, quote, noted in a fishing boat off the Isle of Eriskay from the singing of Gillespie MacInnes. And there's more of the tale in her introduction. So people using her collections would feel that they understood the context in which the tune was collected. In fact, she says this tune put her in mind of Bourgault de Coudray's Trente Mélodies de Basse-Bretagne. It's hard to say. It's certainly quite atmospheric, hinting at the work of the later French Impressionists. There isn't time to say much more about Kennedy Fraser today, but I think it's worth noting in passing that in 1924 she did actually collaborate with the composer Granville Bantock, he lived from 1868 to 1946, for his Celtic folk opera The Seal Woman. She contributed the text and 16 songs from the first 2 books of her Songs of the Hebrides, and she sang the title role as well. This collaboration gives some indication of the significance attached to her work by other more classically minded composers. And PowerPoint 22 brings us to another composer, Hamish McCunn, who was very much tied up with the same Celtic twilight movement, even if his music is generally more connected with the classical tradition. He was the son of a Greenock shipbuilder, but he went to London to study at the Royal College of Music in 1853, and he largely stayed in England after that. He's famously known for an orchestral piece called The Land of the Mountain and the Flood, which is regularly played in concert programmes to this day. Its title comes from a line in a Walter Scott poem called The Lay of the Last Minstrel. McCunn also wrote other orchestral pieces such as The Dowie Denzer Yarrow and Ship of the Fiend, a couple of operas, Jeanie Deans and Diarmid, and over 150 songs. The story of Jeanie Deans was derived from another Walter Scott novel. You begin to see how much McCunn was influenced by his Scottish heritage. And like Marjorie Kennedy Fraser, he too knew Wagner and Debussy's music. If anything, he was probably more influenced by them than she was. However, amongst his songs were 4 books of Scottish song arrangements that he wrote in 1891. And I think this illustrates the inspiration that the Scottish heritage continued to exert on musicians and composers at all levels. Even composers with higher ambitions, and an interest in more varied genre than those of Marjorie Kennedy Fraser, were still eager and happy to be associated with books of Scottish songs. Now, I've strayed away from the more traditional kind of national song collections, but I couldn't finish this lecture without coming back full circle to the Scottish songs and fiddle tunes known and loved by people of all walks of life, both at home and abroad. PowerPoint 23 brings us home to Glasgow. Did you know that Glasgow, once known as the second city of the British Empire because of its industrial success in the Victorian era, was home to 3 major publishers of popular Scottish music right up to the mid-20th century? We have some of their music in the library. Cheap, mass-produced compilations of Scottish songs and tunes published by Kerr's Music, Mozart Allen, and Bailey and Ferguson. If your grandparents bought music, ask if they remember the names of these publishers. Musicians have tended to look down on these collections in recent years, but we shouldn't forget that for many decades, these were what people recognised as Scottish music. They were played by the likes of Jimmy Shand, sung by Kenneth McKellar, and piled up in piano stools in Scotland, England, and beyond. Flick through them and you still find some tunes from earlier famous collections, such as the fiddle tunes composed by Neil Gow and his famous sons, or songs by Robert Burns. Perhaps their style is not to our liking today, but they do actually bridge the gap between the Georgian and Victorian collections that I've been talking to you about today and the folk revival of the 1960s. From that point of view, we can't dismiss them entirely, even if we don't make much use of them nowadays. And I think that's the message I'd like to leave with you today. My last slide, PowerPoint 24, summarises what I've been saying. Each generation has had its own perception of what Scottish music is, how it should sound, how it should be accompanied or performed, and how it should be collated and published. Even in any one particular era, different compilers may have had different priorities. So when you pick one of these books up, the secret is to try to work out what made these songs and tunes so important to their collector and what they were trying to achieve in their publication. The clues are generally hidden within the books themselves. Thank you.